Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming in Trento. Let me start with a quotation from Shakespeare. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. This one is the third edition of our international meeting on legal argumentation. The number 15, more precisely, is an annual conference named GTR, meaning in Italian, Giornate Tridentine di Retorica, and in English, Trento Days on Rhetoric. A long period, if compared with other conferences in Italy, 15 years, but a rather short one as an international event, only 3 times, and this is the third. Let me say how grateful I am to our guests, to all of you, and especially to those coming from abroad. We count a lot on you, because we believe that Trento had the chance to become a reference point for legal argumentation in Italy, and also a link between Italian scholars on legal argumentation and foreigners. Of course, I perfectly realize that you are now at the very beginning, and that maybe we cannot be as attractive as other European centers are. This is a small city under the shadow of the Alps with a medium-sized university. It's hard to think to be able to attract dozens of scholars all over the world. But with your help, we plan to become more and more interesting for researchers in Italy and abroad. So please, if you will have a good time in Trento, if you'll find a friendly atmosphere and challenging presentation, let's talk about that to your colleagues and mates. You are our best advertising. Before starting officially the meeting, I would like to thank all the people who worked hard to make this conference successful. First of all, Serena and Federico, my 2 precious collaborators. Then the faculty staff, from our dean to the administrative clerks. And the special thank is due to Giorgia Sartori for a clever and constant cooperation. I have imagined a possible visual synthesis of what the organizing committee would like to be the peculiar character of the conference. And I've prepared a slide for that. You know that Neptune's trident is the symbol of the city of Trento. The name Trento comes from Latin tridentum. Well, this is the picture, and just like every trident has 3 tips. And also, I hope also the GTR conference can have 3 tips, and the first one is, of course, argumentation, for it's our main issue of investigation. And the second tip is law, the specific field of our researches. But I guess that the third tip of the conference could be friendship. And I think it could be the best logo for us and for our job. And now, on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Giuseppe Nesi, and as President of the Research Center on Legal Methodology, I declare the conference officially open. Federico, please, the floor is up to you. As
Thanks
chairman of our first keynote lecture by Professor Leo Groarke of Trent University. Thank you, Leo.
Thanks a lot, Maurizio. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to chair the first session of GTR, especially with Leo, who is a really strict friend of mine. And so I'm really excited and to be here for you. I would like to just briefly introduce Leo Groarke, who has had valuable executive experience He has been provost at the University of Windsor and now is president at Trent University. In addition to an impressive administrative experience, his academic credentials are extensive. He has studied at the University of Calgary, Simon Fraser University and the University of Helsinki, and he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Western Ontario in 1982. He has several achievements and international reputation in teaching, research, editorial board membership, conference, and institute leadership, as well as editorial contribution to many critical notes, articles, journals, and books. His areas of research and scholarly interest include ancient philosophy, higher education, social and political thought, and informal logic. His most recent work examines the role of visual images in reasoning, argument, and persuasion, a role that is iconic in digital communication. His influential scholarship includes the book Good Reasoning Matters, co-edited with Christopher Tyndale, and is also editor-in-chief of the journal Wisdom Studies in Argumentation. Today, Leo Groarke is going to discuss with us a paper, Modes of Arguing, Logophilia and the Limits of Language. So Leo, the floor is up to you, and thanks a lot to be here.
Thank you, Federico. Just going to choreograph this a little bit. You might want to move, because I'm going to use this one. I have been told that I need to stay seated, which is something I find difficult to do. But for the sake of the recording, I will do that. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, Maurizio, Federico, and Serena, not just for organizing the conference, but also for the friendship that they have extended. So we have had a wonderful time so far in Trento, and I think I can speak for everyone that we're very excited to be here. Maurizio has said to me that the idea is to run this as a very informal workshop, so I'm going to take that to heart. And what I really want to do is stimulate some conversation, so that by the time we're done, lots of people will have had a chance to talk, and hopefully that will push us further. So I'm going to try to take about 30 minutes instead of 45, present some ideas, and then let's have discussion. Let me begin with just a general account of what I want to do and where I want to go in this talk. Okay. And where I want to begin is with Plato in the Phaedo. And in the Phaedo is a dialogue about Plato's Socrates' last hours before his execution. And one of the most famous comments that Socrates is supposed to make in the dialogue is this comment. He's debating, discussing with other people, and he warns them when they're worried about the argument, beware that you do not succumb to misologia, which I roughly translate as the hatred of words in argument, the worst of all conditions that can befall a person. Now, we can talk about it later if you want. I will say, for many reasons, I think this is a very strange thing for Socrates to be saying. And I don't think really Socrates is saying this. I think Plato is saying this, and he has put this into the mouth of Socrates. But I want to begin with this idea, which is prevalent throughout Western thought, and certainly throughout Western philosophy, that the worst thing that could happen is that we could become skeptical of words in argument. And I want to compare misologia as Plato talks about it, to what I'm going to call logophilia. And logophilia is the converse, the contrary of misologia. It is the love of words in argument. And whereas Plato is concerned that people will fall victims to misologia and underestimate the power of words in argument, my concern is just the opposite, is that we live in an intellectual, cultural context where we're so in love with arguing in words that we do not appreciate its limits. We are not open, and in this conference, I would say we are not open to other ways of arguing. My ultimate conclusion, because this is a conference of law, and I wrote, I think, too general a paper for this. So let me say that my argument will be that in the case of law, for law to do what law is supposed to do, it needs to get over logophilia and accept that there are different modes of arguing, legitimate modes of arguing that do not rely just on words. So law, like argumentation theorists and arguers in general, need to move in that direction. So there's my conclusion. Argumentative practices, like those that inform courts of law, need to overcome their tendency to logophilia, to overemphasize argument in words if they are going to properly deal with evidence and the other issues that they deal with. Let me just say in passing that though one might not think this looking at what argumentation theorists rise, of course, there is a long tradition of thinkers, philosophical thinkers, that have doubts about the use of words. And I've just listed, we could talk about ancient philosophy, we could talk about Parmenides, Heraclitus, Zeno, etc. We could talk about Eastern traditions that, like Taoism, that emphasize the limits of words. I highlight Wittgenstein because he is an author I'm particularly interested in and mention later on in the paper. And I included here two quotes from Wittgenstein, one from the early Wittgenstein and one from the later Wittgenstein. The first is from the Tractatus, of course. There is indeed the inexpressible, what is beyond words, if you like. It shows itself. It is the mystical. And from his later work, this is from his lecture on ethics, my whole tendency, and I believe the tendency of all men who ever tried to write or talk ethics or religion, was to run against the boundaries of language. This running against the walls of our cage is perfectly, absolutely hopeless. Okay? That sets the stage. Let me go next to just a few examples. And my own view is that people who have discussed multimodal argument within the context of discussions of argumentation have provided many clear examples of argument which rely on something other than words. I take 3 points. I won't go into detail, but I take arguing to be an attempt to justify some conclusion, or more rhetorically, to convince other people of some conclusion. And not in all cases, but in many cases, arguments try to do both those things. Secondly, if you want a standard form for arguments, something, therefore, premises, therefore conclusions. Of course, what I'm going to be arguing in the context of multimodal argument is that those premises or those conclusions don't have to be in words. The standard traditional view of argument is that premises are sentences, or the proposition sentences appeal to. The conclusion of an argument is also a sentence of the proposition that it appeals to. But in overcoming logophilia, and I want to open the door to other kinds of arguing where what functions as a premise, what functions as a conclusion may be expressed in other ways. Visually, not just visually, it can be said. Something in nonverbal ways is the best way to put it. And I just generally say that multimodal arguing is arguing that uses non-verbal modes of expression. And I will give some examples that are a little broader than visual, but let me begin with just three, I take very simple examples that are instances of multimodal argument. The first example I give, I will mention one of my brothers is a criminal a lawyer, and I'm taking this from a case he dealt with, which was a particular murder case. And in the murder case, the issue was the person who was murdered was in the center of the room, and there were different people in each of the different corners of the room. And the evidence had shown that somebody in that room had killed the person, but they had to figure out which of the persons it was. So a key component of the evidence became an autopsy that they did. And, lawyers are much better at difficult images than I am, but he insisted in a brotherly way on showing me images of the autopsy. And in the autopsy, they cut the head in 7 slices because what they wanted to show was the trajectory of the bullet. Because then once you saw the trajectory of the bullet, you could know from which corner the gun was shot from, and that could give you evidence as who was guilty. This evidence was introduced to the court. That would be an example of multimodal argument. Let me give you, as a second example, a medical example. In Ontario, where I live, in fact, the medical system has set up a system of transmitting images, and these are images that are used to diagnose serious head and back injuries that people have. And the government's problem was that the experts who can diagnose what has happened in a particular injury are spread all over the province and are typically not there to look at a patient and exhibit a patient. And what the system does is it transmits images across the province. So if someone has a back injury in where I live in Lakefield, Ontario, they can go to the hospital, they'll do an MRI, they may do photographs, and those images will be sent to a doctor in Windsor, Ontario, who will do the diagnosis and then send it back. That's a clear case of inference. The doctor takes that evidence, of course, probably takes a story to it. It's multimodal in that sense. Takes that evidence, draws a conclusion about what injury they're dealing with, prescribes treatment, and sends it back. That's example 2. And the third example I have borrowed from Ian Dove. Ian Dove writes about an argument that he calls argument by fit. He says, imagine that you have a jigsaw puzzle and you're trying to put the jigsaw puzzle together and you have a piece in your hand and now you're trying to figure out where it goes. You might look at a picture that shows what the puzzle is to look like. You might look at the contours, etc. There is a complex visual inference that is made about where this piece fits in that puzzle, which is typically done wordlessly. In fact, I put down here the Jigsaw Puzzle Doctor because I think it illustrates this point. The Jigsaw Puzzle Doctor is a company that you can find on the web if you've got any puzzles that have missing pieces. And what they will do is, it's very frustrating. You make a 2,000-piece puzzle and your children come along and take one piece and it's missing. How do you get it? The Jigsaw Puzzle Doctor will create you a piece that fits exactly. What is interesting from the point of view of here is one condition for the jigsaw puzzle doctor creating the new puzzle piece is you must send a picture of the surrounding part of the puzzle. Without that, they can't manage to do the puzzle. And you can imagine to try to verbally describe what goes on is almost impossible in that case. So that's argument from fit. That's another example of a multimodal argument. In dealing with visual arguments, but also other multimodal arguments, I use something that in some ways I borrowed from Paul Vandenhoven, and I call them KC tables, just key component tables. And essentially, a key component table is you pick out the crucial pieces of the argument, you put them in a table, and then I like to diagram them. And so in the case of the puzzle piece, and it's actually, these illustrations are right, but you will understand the idea. What I note is the key components of the argument, what works as the premises in the argument, are visually perceived. They're not sentences that are put in there. They're key details of what you see. Once you do the table that way, it's surprising how easily it is to represent it just the way you would represent any argument. I mean, any modus ponens argument could be represented as, X is, if X then Y is X in that case, therefore Z. The difference here is that you're treating the visual components of the argument purely in a visual way as non-verbal entities. And my own experience, and I'm becoming more and more convinced as I work with these kinds of arguments, that this kind of non-verbal table is the best way to deal with those arguments. Okay, let me go from there now, maybe a little controversially, to the state of argument theory. And what I want to say when I look at argument theory, and I just put a black box with logophilia here, is that I think various commentators in argumentation theory have been working on nonverbal modes of argument, visual argument being one, but not the only alternative mode. Argumentation theorists have been working on this, I would say, for 20 years. The first article I wrote on visual argument was in 1996. If you look very hard, you can find an extensive literature. You can find many useful distinctions that people have made. Gabby Kiszczek, for example, has extended this to arguments that are built on the sounds of people's voices, not the words they're using, but their tone of voice, etc. I think you can find lots of work, but what surprises me the most is how little impact this has had on mainstream argumentation theory. In mainstream argumentation theory, the assumption is still that a good introductory example of an argument is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And it's verbal, arguments are made up of words, and the traditional distinctions apply. So one of the questions I ask myself, because I think, of course, the start of a new theory, a theory of nonverbal arguing, that is something, the development of that theory will take years. That is to be expected. But a great deal of work has been done. How can you take rhetorical principles and apply them to visual arguments? How do pragma-dialectical principles apply in this case? That work has been done, but and I think everybody acknowledges it now, but it has not become a central component of argumentation theory. What's the reason for that? My answer is it's logophilia. Because people are still in love with words as the key way to express ourselves and construct arguments. So my job here is to be a bit of an antidote, okay, to logophilia, and that's what I want to do in the rest of this talk. So, and I don't know if it's maybe it's because I feel neglected and Paul and Gabby and I, people don't pay enough attention to us. But I find that as I think about the issues, I'm becoming more, not less strident about the significance of nonverbal modes of arguing. So it occurred to me in preparing for this talk that what I need to do is look at, well, everybody assumes that arguments, that verbal arguments are precise, that they're clear, that they are more powerful, and maybe sometimes people do a few funny things with images, but they are weak, we can't understand what they say, they're ambiguous, etc. I need to more forcefully make the point that that exaggerates, not only does it underestimate the significance of nonverbal arguing, but it greatly exaggerates the efficacy of verbal argument. So that's really what I'm trying to do in this paper. And actually, I will say that I wanted to go further than I've gone in this paper. I wanted to actually respond to a talk that Federico gave at ISA, but I can only do so much, and I'm going to point a way to go even further by the time I'm done. Here I want to essentially emphasize three things about words. That words are very limited carriers of meaning. Particularly in comparison with visuals. Words are inherently imprecise, quite the contrary of those people who have attacked visual arguments. Visuals are often much more precise than words are. And thirdly, and maybe this is of special significance in a legal context, words have limited evidential value. And in each of these cases, my argument is that of course, there are many poor visual arguments. I'm not suggesting all visual arguing or all nonverbal arguing is good argument. Quite the contrary. But in all these three cases, there are many situations where multimodal forms of argument, instances of argument, are much stronger than verbal arguments. So I wanted to, let me give some examples. I thought I would give, and excuse me, I'm going to read just a little part of the paper here for my first example. And this is thinking back to Windsor, where I have a house. I look out the window of my home office and see Pesh Island in the middle of the Detroit River. On a particular day in the winter, there may be hundreds, even thousands of birds, because it's a place where the water stays open. Canada is a very cold country, so the birds all come in the winter. On a particular day in the winter, there may be hundreds, even thousands of birds, bald eagles, blue herons, swans, geese, owls, ducks of many sort. And we have a photograph that could illustrate this, saw 32 bald eagles sitting on a tree on the island that's right across from my house. In a sweep of the horizon, I can see them, myriad waves on the water, thousands of trees, the sky, clouds, and Detroit across the river. When the water is open, I see boats of many varieties, kayaks, of course, canoes, motorboats, cruise ships, speedboats, sea-doos, paddleboards, a paddle wheel, and so on and so forth. Now, the point I just want to make is that if I want to show you, that's an all right description of what you see. But if I want to show you in a precise way what I see at a particular time outside my house, it's actually a very limited description. The way to do it is to go visual. And to put it into an argumentative context, because we're talking about arguments here, I want you to imagine that I'm selling my house. And I thought about selling my house. And when I'm selling my house, a key component in convincing, by argument, people that they should buy my house is it has a wonderful view. Now, I can obviously convey that argument in different ways. I could try to convey it verbally. I noted 4 different ways I might do this. I could describe the view as I have. Not too bad. I might show you a photograph or a video or a series of photographs that illustrate the view. And of course, the view changes every season. The spring is different than the fall, etc. I might install a video camera which allows you to see the view for yourself whenever you want over an extended period of time. I might invite you to rent the house for a period of time so that you can experience the view firsthand before deciding whether you should buy it. Now, the point I want to make is that this is a circumstance in which visual means of arguing, providing visual evidence, is profoundly superior to providing verbal evidence. And I have a series of views. These are not actually these are from different places. But so let me give you some views. Actually, this is from my house in Lakefield. It's just, the sunset. I was kayaking there. Yeah, it was very nice. And you're all welcome. This is a very friendly, conference. I'm going to take Federico kayaking here. That's the plan. This is just a shot in Ireland. This is actually the Detroit house. You get some sense of it. Now, if you want to think about it, if you do a very high quality pictures now, you can have millions of pixels. You can blow that up so you look in each of those windows in the boats and you can see if there's a face in there. You can see how close they are. You can count the leaves on some of the trees. That visual way of providing evidence for the conclusion is vastly more powerful than verbal. I want to give another example, less personal. This is a design schematic for the first automatic watch. And of course, I think that the question we need to ask ourselves is, I want you to think about all the information that's conveyed there. The spatial arrangements of the different parts, the shape of the different parts, how the different parts relate to one another, the color of the different parts, etc. And if you were a class of mine, I might say your homework assignment is now to go and provide me with a verbal description that provides me with all the information I need. And I wouldn't do that. That would be a very unkind thing to do to students. But again, it's the information conveyed is vastly superior to what... I don't think there is any practical way to convey that information, which is, of course, why designers and engineers use design schematics. It's, they haven't gotten rid of them. They use them all the time. They've got more sophisticated in the ones that are possible. Let me go to words are inherently imprecise. And I had 3 examples here. One is Beethoven's 7th Symphony. And I went and I looked at reviews of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, different performances of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. And let me just very quickly say that, of course, a review can give you a kind of approximate understanding and a feeling for what happened. But of course, if you want in a precise, exact way to understand what happens in a particular performance, you need to listen to that performance. And probably, if I'm trying to convince you something of that performance, the more effective way to do that is, of course, probably to use some words, but then say, listen to this excerpt. Listen to how they played these 18 bars of the symphony. There's no way to capture that verbally. So here we're not talking about visuals, we're talking about audio, but the same point applies. Let me go to color terms, and I have an example here. When we want to be precise about colors, we don't use words. And the experiment that I thought of, I had recently in my administrative position, we were redesigning residences at Trent University. Just think of Trento without the O. And a big issue that came up was how should we paint them? What color should we paint them? And this sounds minor, but it mattered a great deal to students. I'm sympathetic to the students. In general, they wanted much more varied, wilder colors than other people. We had to decide the debate about what kinds of colors. It was impossible to have that debate verbally. What we did was we got a computer program that took all the various hallways and painted them. In a digital way, we took digital images and we filled in these different colors, and that's how we decided them. Here again, it's the non-verbal visual sample that is the precise way to present it. And if you doubt this, I mentioned this to Jean, if you doubt this, here's my challenge for you. When you want to paint your house next, and let's imagine you want to paint a room and you're a wild person, so the room is a vibrant red or something like that, go to the paint store and try to explain to the person that you want the same red color. Do it verbally and see what you end up when you go back. Of course, the people in the paint store will think you're crazy. What you need to do is take a sample, a non-verbal sample of that paint, give it to them, and they will then be able to give you an exact match. So that's another example of precision. And I just, and the last example I wanted to use, and it fits with what I had said before, is medical diagnosis. Of course, when you go to see a doctor, they don't want to just hear the words that you utter to describe your ailment. They need to see it. And when doctors study various kinds of ailments, they study images, and actually increasingly so. One medical tool that I've used as examples before is the so-called frozen man, I won't say experiment, the frozen man project. Actually, there's a frozen man and a frozen woman project. This was done in the United States. I forget the university. It was the American Medical Association, where they took a man who had died and they froze him solid and they cut him into pieces, into tiny little pieces. And you can do amazing medical studies that way. You can take a blood vessel and trace it through and see what happened. But again, visual evidence is absolutely clear in that context. Let me go to the last premise of my argument, that words have limited evidential force. And let me start with the obvious, that seeing with one's eyes, and we have to be careful here because seeing with one's eyes is not infallible. That's one thing I would want to emphasize. It is open to debate in different circumstances, but seeing with one's eyes obviously has more evidential value than someone telling you the same thing in words. So I'm standing outside and someone says, Serena is at GR15. Well, okay, if I just go by what they've said and if I trust them, I might believe that. Obviously, that doesn't carry the evidential force as seeing that Serena is there. I have an example, a Scotch example here, which I thought was very funny, but you may not. And keep in mind, I'm trying to be multimodal here, not just visual. And what interested me in the case of Scotch is Scotch. I like Scotch, and I have a collection of Scotch tasting notes, which border on the ludicrous, I guess I would just have to say. So here's a description. This is a verbal attempt to describe a Scotch called Monkey Shoulder. And it's very strange because as we've been traveling, I've seen this. I almost wanted to try it to see how it compares with the tasting note. But this is what happens when people try verbally. And though I'm not going to, I will if you push me in the discussion, I would refer to Wittgenstein here. Wittgenstein is someone who appreciates how difficult it is to put feelings and sensations, the whole private language argument, into words. This is what happens when they try to describe monkey shoulder. The nose, an elegant, stylish nose of marmalade, crema catalana. Apologies, but it really is there. Cocoa and malt. Plenty of vanilla and a sprinkling of winter spice, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, alongside a mouth-watering hint of aniseed. Palate. Very malty, creamy delivery with a suggestion of berry fruit. Juicy toasted barley, cloves, and butterscotch. Manuka honey, hot buttered toast, and deep apricot develop. You know, when I read these things, I feel like I'm kind of taste blind or something, because how they get all this out of it, I don't know. Finish. Medium length, yeah, you can get the length of a finish. Spicy oak and a hint of peppermint on the tail. Now, overall, and to me, this is where the limits of words they're struggling with, according to the Monkey Shoulder website, quote, some say it tastes just like riding bareback on the wild moors of Scotland with a flame-haired maiden on Christmas morning. Others agree it tastes like 007 wearing a tuxedo wetsuit. This is a whiskey to be enjoyed. Blah, blah, blah. Now, you know, the point I want to make here, I mean, I don't know what to make of tasting notes, and people, I think, are rightly skeptical of them. Suppose we are having an argument about Scotch, and suppose I want to demonstrate, I mean, argumentatively demonstrate that this is a great Scotch. Of course, I could use words in that sort of way, but if I really want to taste you with Scotch, what I do is I take the Scotch and I pour a tasting for you, and you taste the spot. That's a non-verbal experience. I provide the premises for the conclusion that this is a great Scotch by having you taste the Scotch. So this is another example where the evidential value of non-verbal ways of expressing premises is much stronger than doing it verbally. Now I want to finish, because this is about law, talking about a legal case. And of course, all that I'm saying about multimodal argument, and some people here, Paul would be one of them, can say more about what happens in the courts, but all that I'm saying about multimodal argument applies to arguing as it goes on in the courts, or at least most of it does. The case I want to look at is a case that Ian Dove has discussed. It's Doggett versus the state of California. I'm just telling you what the case is. I hope I don't offend anyone with this. This is a case in 1948. Okay? This is a case in which a married couple, the Doggetts, were convicted of the crime of, quote, oral sexual perversion on the basis of photographs they themselves had taken of the act in question. So the claim was oral sexual acts were illegal in California at the time. They were convicted of these acts because they themselves had taken photographs of the acts in question. Now, this is a very interesting case for anybody interested in visual argument, because so far as I can tell, this is the first time in the California courts that the courts had to deal with whether this visual, I mean, basically, this was a multimodal argument. Look at these photographs, therefore these people are guilty. Can you have photographs as evidence? Can you have visual evidence? And that was not, at the time, the assumption was, no, it's the verbal model of argument. Arguments are statements, maybe witness statements, etc. But this was the first time photographs were introduced. Now, what I want to say, and if you like, Ian Dove tries to deal with this in a way that it doesn't become a visual argument. And maybe I will note this a little bit, and in view of some discussions, I think, that we have had about the status of visual premises. Because what he wants to say is that when you look at the photographs, it's not argumentative. You're just perceiving that this happened. But the point I want to make is that these serve as premises which are then, like all premises, open to dispute and and discussion. And so in the case of the Doggett trial, we fundamentally misconstrue the arguing if we think that a judge or juror who has shown the photographs at a trial can do what Dove has suggested, i.e. look at the photographs and perceive. He wants to say, they don't infer, they don't argue, they just perceive that it's true that the Doggetts committed the acts in question. At the outset of the proceedings and in the appeal court, the question whether the photographs provide compelling evidence is an open question. In the trial, this makes the question whether the photographs were in fact reliable the locus of the dispute. The defendant's position is recorded in the appeal court decision, which notes that, quote, by these defendants, it is earnestly contended that these photographs were not sufficiently verified or authenticated to make them admissible into evidence, and that without them, the corpus delicti was not established, and there is no evidence in the record showing that this offense was committed. And what I want to do here is I want to emphasize the analogy with verbal argument. You give some verbal premises, somebody who doesn't like your conclusion tries to raise questions about the value, sorry, Jean, I'm going to say the acceptability, if I could say that, or the truth, whichever way you want to go of those premises. Now, in the visual case, that's precisely what happens. In making the contrary case, this is the case that the premises, the visual premises, were solid, the prosecution went to elaborate, and I mean very elaborate lengths to prove that the photographs were authentic and not, quote, faked. This included photographing the contents of the Doggett's apartment to show that the furniture in the photographs was theirs, proving that the camera that took the photographs was Mr. Doggett's, establishing that the photographs were developed in a dark room in the Doggett's apartment, and finding witnesses who testified that the people in the photographs were the defendants at the trial. So, I'm going to end and open it to discussion. What I want to say is it's surprising to me that here we are 70 years after the Doggett trial, where at least in California the court started to deal with visual evidence. And I would say in argumentation theory, we still haven't figured out what to do with that evidence. I think lots of progress has been made by individual commentators, but we're still, if I can put it this way, suffering from logophilia, and mainstream argumentation theory still can find no room for appreciating nonverbal arguing. Thank you very much.
So, we have, I think, a good time for discussion now, about 30 minutes. Just feel free to ask to Leo, to comment, to give your opinion. So, first Maurizio, then Marco. You have to speak to the mic, please.
First of all, thank you, Leo, for your very stimulating presentation about this argumentation. You argumented in a verbal way, very effective, in fact. And when you spoke about some examples, I remember something I listened to when I was a young student in the high school about Isadora Duncan, the famous dancer. And many years ago, at the beginning of the 12th century, he had an interview from a journalist saying that, please, could you describe to our readers what dance is for you? And the answer of Isadora Duncan was, if I could, I shouldn't dance. And that was and is for me a perfect example of what you have explained to us. I wonder, what is misologia and logophilia? You said misologia is to be skeptical about the force of verbal arguments, correct? And logophilia, on the contrary, is the dominant tendency which overestimates the verbal argument. So my first question is, multimodal argumentation is totally misologic, in a sense, because according to me, your opinion is not exactly that multimodal is a way for being truly misologic. And my second question is about the basis, on the basis of what we divide between verbal and non-verbal argumentation. As for myself, I think that the dominant tendencies about the overestimation of verbal argument is based upon a certain idea of rationality, of what rationality is, what is rational, reasonable. For someone believes verbs are truly rational, and images, sounds, smells are not rational, are irrational, not rational. Might we say that rational doesn't deal with the stuff of the argumentation, which could be visual or non-visual, verbal or non-verbal. Rationality deals with the frame according to which we set up our verbs or our images. Thank you.
Maybe I will just, I don't know if I will respond to all that you said, but just a quick comment, and I'm thinking we will have a long discussion here. I want to say something about the Duncan example, the dancing example, because I said that in a way I felt like I dealt with the easy cases here. I think the more difficult cases are cases that have to do with art, that might have to do with dancing, or that might have to do with visual art, Picasso's Guernica, when we're arguing about war, etc., that might have to do with poetry, sort of non-literal manifestations of the non-verbal. And it seems to me that there must be a place for that in arguing as well. Exactly how one makes that place, I'm not sure. But I think we need to go there. I think your distinction between your account of rationality is an interesting one. I'd have to think about it a lot. I thought that at the recent conference in Portugal, some people were making an interesting distinction between rationality and reasonableness. And they wanted reasonableness to have a much broader sway than rationality. And if you think of rationality as just adhering to certain structures of belief or inference or reasoning, maybe one can make that work. Whether the visual fits into the rational or just the reasonable, I think I can probably live with it either way. That's just a couple thoughts.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm not so much familiar with visual argumentation, so it was especially interesting and I would say provoking for me. But it seems my point is a bit similar than of Professor Mancin. It seems that your approach wants to take us back to some, I don't know, pre-modern type of perception. Like, I don't know, in a way that this critic, I guess it is against this conceptualization, abstract thinking, you know. I'm aware that, but yeah. You're right, yeah, and that we try to balance these two different approaches. But if we have this sensual approach that you used, is there also an intuitive one, as also, you know, irrational type of, you know, of approach?
So I don't know if this would satisfy you. I think it's interesting what you say. I would say that, for example, in medieval times, the use of visual argument is very common and very profound, because when you have a non-literate public, you need to communicate with them, and you need to convince them of certain... I guess my favorite example is the walls of medieval cathedrals have the torments of the damned painted all over them, and you're to make an inference. Those aren't just there for aesthetic purposes. They're to convince you that you shouldn't sin because, and here's some reasons, and they're provided visually. So I think it's true that in non-literate societies, you may have more visual argument. But that doesn't mean that in literate societies, there isn't a place for visual argument.
Yes, but then how can we... I agree that with words you cannot, express all these, you know, I don't know, we have different modes of communication or different means of communication, and words are only one type of them.
Yes.
But then how would you reconcile all of these different ways of communication, for example, in a reasoning of a court decision?
Maybe I'm going to say, maybe I'm wrong, that it isn't difficult because I'm not excluding words. If you understand multimodal arguing as creating space for nonverbal and verbal arguing, and you can verbally set the context for a nonverbal argument, or they supplement one way or the other. By the way, I think also that sometimes visual arguing is more abstract. If you look at the history of argument diagrams, for example, that's an abstract way to communicate how we understand particular kinds of argument. But I think, and it's interesting, many of the people who, and there are some, I say there are many, who have argued against visual arguing. One standard way of arguing is to say there are no, and this is a word that's used often, purely visual argument. I don't know if there are purely visual. My suspicion is there probably are, but it doesn't matter. In the world today, we mix words and visual images and smells and sounds of various sort. So even if there are no purely visual arguments, that doesn't mean we don't need to pay attention to the nonverbal, but it can be embedded within a verbal theoretical discussion, or it can be embedded in rationality of the sort that was suggested. And I don't know, maybe the best way to explain that is verbally. So I don't think it's a problem.
So multimodality is not totally miscellaneous?
No. I want to say multimodality is a balanced view. And it doesn't go too far in either direction.
Like our logo.
Like your logo. So, because of course I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of verbal argument and that in argumentation conferences we shouldn't try to analyze it, but I'm suggesting that we need to understand that the notion of argument is more basic, and it's not just verbal. That's the point of view.
Because I'm afraid that often in reasoning of court decisions, a lot of things are, missed. That reasoning does not encapsulate everything what was going on. For example, not only in the courtroom, but only in the, for example, if there is no jury in the heads of judges. But then there is no way to, to communicate with this nonverbal,
Well, it's interesting, and of course, there are lots of cases, and especially now as digital means of communication make it so easy to transmit visual images of various sorts. I think the courts, like the rest of society, is using those images a lot more, but I don't think it's fully understood how. And what occurs to me is a case I read about this is an Australian case, and the issue was indigenous land rights, whether particular native groups indigenous to Australia had a right to certain lands, and the indigenous people were allowed to make submissions to the court. And one of the things that I forget, it wasn't the Maori, I think it was a different group, but one of the things they did culturally was they created sand paintings. It was very much a part of their culture. So they created an enormous sand painting, which was then submitted as evidence to the court. What one is supposed to do with that, I'm not sure I know, but I think that's a question. We have to take that seriously.
Then Pedro first.
Continue on that remark, because
Maybe he knows.
Pedro before. It's up to you.
just
Maybe
about that case, because it was not only a painting, but in that case it was also allowed to sing. And they had these oral songs, and the end in the case, it was accepted by the court, because they sang and they made their songs, and then they were experts, and they could calculate from the songs about the generations, and they mentioned all kind of specifics of areas, and then they went over there and made excavations, and then everything in terms of generations turned out to be exactly as in the song. And then in the end, for that reason, as additional evidence, they accepted the song and the content of the song as evidence. That's, by the way, a verbal song, but that's my later comment.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's very healthy for us rhetoricians to hear something like this kind of argumentation. But I want to know what's your definition of logos? Because I think when Parmenides or Protagoras or Plato and even Aristotle used the word logos, they had something very different in mind. And I think that the concept logos is much broader than words or speech or verbal communication. So I think mathematics and music and painting are sort of logos too. Or even the nature is has a sort of logos, own logos. And the second question is, why do you have to use so many words to affirm that words are not so important or powerful? Because you used a lot of images, but 90% of your presentation consists of words, I think. And the third comment is, I think of the problems of describing sensations and experience in music, tasting, has to do with the ability of creating powerful metaphors. So when we say this sound is warm or mellow, or I don't know, when we create this kind of descriptions, it shows that we have a very powerful way of dealing with these problems by creating metaphors. That's my point of view.
So I think there's three things you've said that, and I'll respond to each of them. So, of course, you're right about logos, but I think that it's absolutely clear that in the Phaedo, what Plato, and actually the word logos is used in different ways by different ancient authors, and at one point, for example, a fable is considered a logos. But we're talking about Plato. And for Plato, Plato is not open to images. He's not open to art. He's quite explicit about that. So I think it's very clear that he is, and also if you look at Plato's dialogues and what he's talking about, it's very clear that he's there talking about verbal discourse. And elsewhere, Plato attacks artists because, images are the wrong way to do it. So So I agree with you about logos, but I think in that case, and I'm trying to talk about the use of words, so I think that works. I would just say, I don't feel that I'm sort of caught because I've used words to express the views here. I don't think I could have made the points I've made without some of the images that I've used. I'm a multimodal person. And of course, words, I think there are interesting cases like argument diagrams, but in general, I think words are better at expressing theoretical concepts. So, and that doesn't bother me, and I don't think it shows that the visuals and nonverbal means of communication aren't important. So I'm not worried about the fact that I use words. The last point, of course, when people struggle with the meaning of sensations and trying to convey it, they use metaphors. My point as an argumentation theorist, as someone interested in arguments, is that the metaphor is not as evidentially strong as the direct experience of what the sensation is. That's the point I'm making. So, sure, people struggle with metaphors, and I think in poems, sometimes people do a magnificent, I didn't think in this case with Monkey Shoulder, but in some cases people do amazing things with words, but I don't think, or it would be extremely rare to have a case where the metaphor had the evidential force as the sensation itself. So once you accept that you can create arguments out of sensations, there's a reason to do that in those particular cases.
May I say something else?
Yeah.
The second question was just a provocation, of course. But sometimes when we have a description of a taste or how an instrument sounds, maybe we begin or start to hear or to feel or to taste what is described. And we couldn't perceive with our tasting or seeing or hearing. And the other thing is, just to complete my, I don't know if it's important. Plato used a lot of mythos and allegories as powerful argumentation too, like the statues of Daedalus and the cave and so on, and the ring of Gigi. I don't know how to say.
Gyges.
In English. Yeah, I don't know how to say in English. So I think that he was not. Maybe he was against poets and sophists, but he was a kind of very creative author and writer and poet, maybe.
Yeah, so as far as Plato goes, I have only been talking here about the distinction between verbal and nonverbal argument. But in a way, you're right. Attached to the traditional conception of argument is not only the conception that arguments are made out of words, but that they have a particular form, which probably doesn't allow fables and probably doesn't allow stories and myths. Some kind of analog to scientific argument. I would just say I'm not making that distinction, but I think it is. I think it is an interesting one. I thought your other comment is interesting too, because I think that often we do use the verbal to better appreciate the visual. But I would also say we often use the visual to better appreciate the verbal. So when I diagram an argument, it might be a verbal argument, and I wouldn't claim that it's a visual argument, but this visual representation can make it much clearer to my audience what that argument is. But I think you're right, it works the other way around, that I think of this as an ostensive use, either of visuals or verbal. It's a pointing. And it's true, you might use the verbal to say, well, just in the aftertaste there, isn't there a taste of cinnamon there? And that directs our attention, and then we appreciate that. So I would agree that both that can happen verbally, but it can also happen visually for verbal. So,
Thank you.
Alessio, and then Jean. At the end, Giovanni.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Very attractive also for me that I'm not familiar with visual argumentation. And I would like to ask something that is in the line even of your reactions to the comments. And so this line also of the balanced view, as I understood, yeah? I mean, I would like to know if for you it's possible to say that within the realm of visual argumentation, we have also some visual arguments produced by words. Produced not by non-verbal modalities, but produced by verbal modalities. I'm trying to...
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. I'm trying to clarify what I mean. I mean that in some cases, we use words and argument with the aim, or even without the aim, but anyway, the effect is the evocation of a plurality of images. And what is very interesting is that it's not just as in some of your example, in order to represent something that we can see. But what is very interesting, above all in legal and political discourse, in legal political language, above all within the theory of institutions, we often are forced to use words to evocate images, but images that are linked with something that we cannot see. An example, the idea of the unity. We cannot see the unity of the state. We cannot see the unity of a polity, but we can use some words in order to evocate an image of the unity. For the reason that we are not able to see the unity. The same is the hierarchy of the sovereign state. We have a lot of examples, and I think that it's a very interesting point of view, in my view, that starts from your presentation to interpret in these terms, for example, very famous theories of classical authors on the origin of the state. I think that, for example, both in Hobbes and Rousseau, you can find the use of arguments, of words, to evocate some images of the state, because you know that just with the images you can... Sorry?
The same
of course. Because just with the images you can communicate some meanings that otherwise you are not able to communicate because you cannot see the core of that meaning. You cannot see, the unity and and a lot of other things. Do you think that this kind of approach is anyway a way of dealing with visual argumentation?
One more question for you, though. So, so far as I know, in the original, I'm thinking of an image of the Leviathan, made up of all the little people. Mm-hmm. Is that a sort of image you're thinking of, or are you thinking of something more abstract than that?
Yeah, in the case of the Leviathan, we have also the support of the cover, of course, and so it's very. But even in other cases, in which you cannot have the support of a cover, there is anyway this aim to evocate this image, these images.
What I would.
Maybe I have a concrete example.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not impolite. The discussion is clearly open. I think a good example maybe is the one of the Italian Constitution. One of the first articles of the Italian Constitution describes the Italian flag, saying the flag of the Italian Republic is the tricolor, and it's made of three parts. The first one is green and the second is white. Isn't this a sort of visual argumentation in verbal terms?
Okay, I had an answer, and now Maurizio makes me think of something different. But so I will just
to make an example of what I believe Alessio is saying about the relationship between verbal and non-verbal
Well, the first thing I would say is I think I have tried to say that in some ways I think I've dealt with the easy cases. Representational images are the easiest case to deal with. So my sympathies, though, are that that we need to account for much more abstract notions and much more complex versions of images. So I would agree that we need to do that. And then exactly how we do that, I want to think some more about it. But I would add that my thinking has always been that as we, not just me, but other people in this room, as we start to understand multimodal argument, we will understand verbal argument better. Because there are verbal analogs to what goes on visually. So even when you get into fables and to myths and to stories, but also abstract notions, the unity of the state is a nice one. I think often the way we argue doesn't fit with the, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's something much more complex going on that has to do with metaphor, with imagistic reasoning. So yes, I think we need to move in that direction, but I'm tempted to say I don't have the answer, but Paul Vandenhoven will provide it in his presentation.
And we'll wait for him.
I'm just teasing
Jean, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leo. It was a very inspiring talk from the perspective of an argumentation theorist. And you mentioned 3 problems with words, right? So my question is about these problems.
Sorry,
so first
Jean,
of
please.
all,
Yeah,
I
thanks.
should talk closer to the mic. So you talked about these 3 problems with words. The first problem would be that words convey limited information. The second, that they are inherently imprecise. And the third problem, that they have limited evidential force, right? Now, I have a very simple, informative question about these 3 problems. What about the interrelatedness, the interrelation of the 3 problems? Because when I thought about it, the third problem, limited evidential force, would be more of a consequence of words being inherently imprecise and convey limited information. And even you could say maybe that the second problem is a consequence of the first one. Words being inherently imprecise could be a consequence of that they convey limited information. So could you elaborate a little bit more about how you think that these problems, which I think are key problems, how they interrelate?
So I think it's a great question, and I don't have a clear answer. I certainly think they overlap. What interests me is to ask the question. I was going in a slightly different way, and I have more in my draft paper. Why is it that images, for example, or nonverbal means of communication, why can they convey more information? Why can they be more precise? Why do they have more evidential value? And I will tell you that here I'm inclined to go to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein makes a distinction between saying and showing. And I think that is a profound distinction. And so, for example, in a case of a simple photograph, what we're trying to do is we're trying to convey physical properties. Words don't have those physical properties. So we have learned that this word is attached to this kind of shape, and etc. It's a relatively clumsy. Whereas when we're using images in the nonverbal, we have those properties. So we can just show them. And because I think it's slightly different that one thing, because we have the properties, we can convey much more information, but we can also convey more precise information. To me, where I started with was, what is important to us when we're trying to convince somebody or to argue for a particular conclusion. Well, the amount of information is important. How precisely we convey it is, that's where I came from. You raise a good question. I don't know exactly the answer, but I know in trying to explain the principles, I'm headed to Wittgenstein.
If I remember correctly, then Wittgenstein is also talking about the ostensive aspect of visuals. So would you then say that, for instance, in an argumentative context, if I would say, put forward a proposition, this bike is red, and you would doubt that, or in a court case, then sometimes you can only show that something is true or acceptable. So then wouldn't that mean that there is this extra type of argument that you could call ostensive argument to add to all the types of argument there are, rather than that it will be a different type?
Well, in the book that Chris and I do, we talk about visual demonstration. So
yes,
in a way, we do, and I don't think, I now think it's not just visual, it could be by taste. So in a certain sense, there is another version of argument there. I don't know if it's quite an argument scheme. That's an interesting question, but there is something there where you're trying to demonstrate some properties. I will share with you sort of my favorite way to illustrate this distinction with Wittgenstein is, Wittgenstein used to be challenged when he spoke that, well, there's the mystical, there's what can't be said. Well, what is all that about? And he used to whistle. And Wittgenstein was famous as a whistler. He would whistle symphonies. People said he could even whistle chords. So when he was faced with those kinds of questions, he used to whistle. And Ramsey said to him, he said that, well, if you can't say it, you can't whistle it either. But I'm disagreeing with that, because if I want to show you what Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is like, not me, but if I'm Wittgenstein and can whistle, actually I can show it in a way whistling, which I can't say. No verbal description is going to be able to capture how it feels or, the sound. So saying and showing is the kind of key to what I want to say underneath all of this, as to why words are more powerful in these cases.
Thank you.
So the last one is Giovanni.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. My question is a philosophical question, which is in some way related to Professor Manzin's question. Are there some analogies with of your approach to Jacques Derrida's criticism to grammatology and to the connection between a certain model of language and a certain model of rationality? Because Derrida criticized the way, the Greek way to think philosophy, to think legal, to think law, starting from a certain model of language, verbal language. So are there some analogies, or is another thing, is another question? Thank you.
So, I proclaim innocence when it comes to Derrida. I mean, I'm an analytic philosopher, and I can't claim to know or understand Derrida. It almost makes me worried that there might be some such association. But that's too strong. Derrida might be right about certain things. I just don't know enough about Derrida that I could comment. But thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, now we're perfectly with our program, and I think that the GTR starts with a very good presentation by Leo Groarke. Thanks a lot. I think we opened the door to the possibility to think another time about what an argument is. I agree with you that the distinction between visual and non-visual is a trick. Because, for example, if we think to a purely verbal field of knowledge, very rational, mathematics, for example, everyone knows that aesthetics is very important in mathematics. So that I think that just from an erroneous point of view, we should say we have just visual or non-visual argument. We are not divided into our soul between logos and pathos, so that I really believe that the interest in visual argumentation is a good way to reconsider, once upon a time, the real nature of man, the real nature of logos, the real nature of argumentation. So thanks a lot, Leo, really, for your very interesting and deep speech. And now we have just our first coffee break is in a room on the right side. Before this, I would remember just a couple of things. The first one is that the last keynote speech given by Giovanni Sartor will be in English. So we will use Italian just for paper presentation in the first session. And so that I hope that everyone should be here on Friday just to listen to Giovanni Sartor. And another thing is this. This evening we will have a dinner in a restaurant nearby the Faculty of Law Trento, is Orso Grigio. And I will just ask you if you want to join us for the dinner. I hope that I don't want to be too rude or unpolite, but the payment is up to you and is self-payment. But if you want to join us, we will be happy about this. Please just tell to Serena, and the dinner is about 8 o'clock p.m. But for us, it will be a pleasure to enjoy dinner with you. So that's all for now, and see you at the coffee break or 5 for paper presentation in room 4, but I think that we should have coffee all together. Thanks a lot.